Welcome to Only One You Need Radio. We're not the only one you need. You are. We just show you how to get out of your own way. With your host, speaker, author, business coach, and consultant, David Dubé.
Welcome to Only One You Need Radio. I'm your host, Dave Dubé. So excited to have you. In this episode, we're going to focus on essentially one question, maybe two. The question is this: where do you find love? Where do you find love? I might also add to that, how do you define love? Very important questions. And once again, this comes to the premise of people get things, but they seldom understand them. A lot of us actually believe we get love, but that's a misunderstanding, a misnomer as it might be. And we're going to talk about that here today. So some of you may already know this and some probably have no clue. You know, my background in 2004, I incorporated my business, Only One You Need. Now that doesn't mean it was extremely successful by any stretch of the imagination, but when I started it based on this course I had created. And the course was called How to Read Anyone and Make Lifelong Clients in Just 30 Seconds. And I remember giving one of my first clients this course. And in doing so afterwards, I had one of the students come up to me and asked me, well, before asking, they complimented me and said, this was a really great course. Now, I'm not trying to toot my own horn by saying this, but she said, you're obviously really good with people, aren't you? Of course, you know, that made me stand up straight, stick my chest out and be like, well, yes, of course. Maybe not in that weird accent, but, you know, I felt very confident at the time. I said, yeah, I would believe I am. She said, well, would you be willing to meet with my fiance and I? And I kind of gathered myself after her asking. I was like, what can I ask, you know, what for? You know, you're obvious, so your fiance, so you're engaged. Why would you need me? She said, well, we're actually having a lot of issues. We're planning our wedding, but at this current moment, I don't think we're going to get married based on how our relationship's going. And that scares me because I love this man and I really want to be with him. I was like, okay, sure. So we met up and they were obviously having some issues. And I don't think you would get that question if they weren't having issues. But one of the questions I had asked them is, you know, where do you find your love? And that was very confusing to them. Well, what do you mean? And then I asked them to define love. And that was also an interesting question because they defined love, and maybe you'll feel the same way about this, you'll think the same way about this, based upon their experiences with those people in their lives that loved them. How their parents, their siblings, you know, aunts, uncles, grandfathers, grandparents, friends, and past relationships. Now, what took most precedence was past relationships, right? Because your family's supposed to love you, supposedly. And then, but everything else was on past relationships. And we had some people who, out of these two, who they were actually both cheated on. And it didn't feel good. And so when you're afraid of getting cheated on, you sometimes act differently than when you're confident and you have everything you need. And that's where they were kind of having this is actually where the big barrier was between them. And then I shared a story of when I was 17 with my first serious girlfriend anyway. And I remember she lived an hour away from where I did, and we dated, I don't know, five months. Prom was coming up and we talked about going to prom. So I bought tickets for prom. I remember buying her shoes. I don't even remember. I may have bought her a dress too. I don't remember what. Spent a lot of money. We'll just say that. And I remember going to the mall the day before prom and picking up the tuxedo. And as I'm in line, there's like this massive line at the mall, and the phone rings. I had my dad's cell phone on me at the time, because unlike today where everyone and every child's born with a phone in their hand, then it wasn't the case. Like 1 in maybe 500 people had a phone. So I had my dad's phone on me. I was that cool. And she calls. It's like, I can't talk right now. It was terrible reception in the mall. Back then, reception wasn't amazing. It wasn't 4G. It was like spotty, very spotty. So anyway, I remember getting my tux, and they tell you before you walk out, they're like, once you leave the store, you don't get a refund on it. And I was like, okay, neat. Thanks for telling me. See you later. As if to say something was going to happen. And so I get home and I call her back, and she proceeds to tell me, you know that guy that I went to school with, and then I transferred schools, so I wasn't going to school with him? Yeah. Well, last night we hung out, and well, right, and you kind of feel like your stomach's starting to slide down. You feel like you starting to feel the emotions build. Your heart starts to pump harder and harder as the anticipation builds for that moment when she tells you. And she did. She told me, I cheated on you. And you kind of sink. And then you have those magic words that come out of your mouth. The magic words are, how could you do this to me? Right? How could you do this to me? I remember saying those words. And I remember like just being overcome with like this immense sadness, like instantaneously, like starting. I don't recall if I had gotten to cry or if I was just starting to sob at the time, but I remember saying, how could you do this to me? And I said it like 2 or 3 times. And I was walking to the back of my house on our cordless phone. Those were a thing back then, cordless phones. And as I was walking to the back of the house outside, like literally as I walked past the side of the house and I was like completely into the backyard, I remember something triggered in me, and it was like instantaneous, and I started laughing and I couldn't stop laughing. And she was so confused. She was like, what is so funny? What is so funny? And so I went from like near, if not crying already, at least near crying, to extreme laughter. It was so weird. She's like, what is so funny? And I said, you are so funny. This is so funny. And she's like, I'm confused. What? And I said, you taught me such a valuable lesson. Mind you, at this time, I don't know where any of this came from. It just like popped into me and just poured out. And she's like, what do you mean? I said, you taught me such a valuable lesson. You taught me that you're not worth my time. You taught me that timing is perfect. She's like, what do you mean by that? I said, if you waited any longer, this would have been so much more difficult. She's like, what would have been? I was like, leaving you, telling you to get lost, to be out of my life would have been so much more difficult if you had waited any longer. But you didn't. I said, you did me a huge favor by doing this. And I told her, I was like, I'm going to be by this weekend and pick up all the stuff that I bought for you for prom so I can return it and get my money back. And after I do that, I lose my number, never talk to me, never call me. I want nothing to do with you. And by the way, this guy, he's going to screw you over 10 times from Sunday. It's going to be so much worse than you just did to me. And I said, but don't worry about me. I'm already over it. And I hung up and it was done. And it was crazy because like it still took me time to figure it out. Like I was like, what did I just do? Like what? Like at the same time, I was like, well, I'm happy it's over. At the same time, like, what just happened? I didn't know that I knew what I knew. It just was something that was a part of me. So I went from like nearest depth of all things that one could ever have happen to them and feel that way, to on top of the world at the same time, because I owned what happened. I didn't let it own me. But what I had realized out of this that was so absolutely valuable, it's just not more than, it's more than one thing. It was several things. The first off, I realized that she did what she did not to hurt me. She didn't cheat. She didn't do what she did with someone else because she wanted to spite David. That's not it at all. In the moment of what she was doing, she was looking for happiness. She was finding pleasure. She wasn't avoiding pleasure, right? She wasn't, you don't invite another guy around or another person of the opposite sex to avoid having fun. No. So she was seeking pleasure. She wasn't trying to hurt someone. She wasn't trying to hurt me, not intentionally, by seeking pleasure over here. It's just it's the side effect of doing that happened to be, well, emotionally, someone might get hurt, right? So she wasn't doing it to spite me. She was doing it to find pleasure in the moment, which is perfectly fine. She can do that. And she did do that. And so for me, I found out how much I actually appreciated and loved me. And I loved myself. I really, it wasn't just a past tense thing. I love myself. I found love in me before I found her. That's why she wanted to actually be with me. Like, there's confidence in who I am. And I realized that out of like all my relationships, I didn't run and find them. I didn't chase anyone. People chased me. The relationships chased me. It's because I knew who I was. I wasn't worried about being hurt, because when someone does something that could hurt you emotionally, it's a reflection of them, not a reflection of you. But you have to know you first. You have to love you first. If you don't love yourself first, you'll get stomped on. You'll get trampled. And it will, lack of a better way, it'll effing hurt. It will. And it'll continue to hurt. But until you know who you are, until you define you, you'll never know. You'll always be a victim of someone else's actions until you define yourself enough to know where your boundaries are, to set those boundaries, and to not let people step on it. And the more you let them step on it, the more they own you, the more they own your emotions, the more they own your love. That's not how love is. Love starts inside of you, not outside of you. See, when someone takes advantage of you, it's because you're validating something through them. You find validation in their actions, in what they do. And if you need them to answer that, you will never have what it is that you truly want, not in your relationships. So when I shared this story to that couple, they realized they never defined love within themselves. And that was the turning point for them and what they really truly desired for their relationship. And when following up with them, their wedding was planned and things were going in the right direction, because they knew that they needed to validate themselves through themselves with their own self-love before they did it through each other. When those are separate, you'll always look for love outside of you. You'll always look for confirmation outside of you. You'll never find it. Not until you find it within you. That's the incredible part about it. Love comes from inside of you. When you find your love, your life will begin to change because people will then be attracted to you because of who you are and not because they're seeking the validation. You see, relationships fall apart when things need to be validated. But when you have self-love, then you don't need that external validation anymore. When you don't need that external validation anymore, then the person that finds you is going to be that one who's not going to need validation from you to be loved by you. That is life-changing. So that's this episode. I hope that was good for you as it was good for me. Quite the storytelling. So it's time that you be the person you're meant to be, believe in all that you're capable of, and become more than you thought imaginable. If you love this podcast, if you like this podcast, please go rate me on iTunes. Share this with friends, share this with family, share this with anyone. And I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.